Chardja, gyfeillion, croeso i'r ddarlitho'n heno, a gynhelir yn hydydd Myles Dillon. A mae'n bleser mawr gen i gyflwyno ein siaradwr ni heddiw, yr athro Patrick Sims-Williams. It's a great pleasure to introduce our speaker this afternoon, Professor Patrick Sims-Williams. Patrick is Emeritus Professor of Celtic at the University of Aberystwyth. His works and achievements are too numerous to be mentioned individually here, but we must at least point out two of his major contributions, the Celtic inscriptions of Britain, and of particular reference to an Irish audience, the Irish influence on medieval Welsh literature. I won't go through all those articles in detail, that would be much too lengthy, but he has written on just about every possible topic that is embraced under Celtic studies, from the ideological construction of Celtic-ness to the minutiae of linguistic change in 12th and 13th century Welsh. So he is the editor of, and founder indeed, of first Cambridge Medieval Celtic Studies and now Cambrian Medieval Celtic Studies, and a fellow of the British Academy. And tonight he is returning to one of his favourite topics, which is early Welsh poetry, with a lecture on Englynion a Beddau, the Welsh Dindshenchas. Please welcome Patrick Sims-Williams.
Diolch yn fawr, Barry. Thank you very much, Barry, for the kind introduction. I share one thing with Myles Dillon, and that is that we share the same birthday, which is 11th of April, if anybody wants to send me a birthday card. But not the same day. I don't mean we were born the same day, but the same day of the year. He was born in 1900. Now, it's a great honour to be given this, giving this Myles Dillon Memorial Lecture, because I once had the privilege of meeting Myles Dillon. Can you hear me at the back, or no? Oh. Could I turn this up? Can you hear me now? There we are. Whoops. Great. So I had the privilege of meeting Professor Dillon once. That was in May 1971, exactly 52 years ago when I was an undergraduate. He'd given the O'Donnell lecture in Oxford on the Irish settlements in Wales, and he was invited over to Cambridge to repeat it for the Anglo-Saxon Society, as it was called then. And if I remember rightly, he'd recently returned from India, but I'm not sure about that. When you're an undergraduate, you think everybody over about 35 or 40 is incredibly ancient. And we all thought that Myles Dillon was really, really, old, incredibly old. But it's a shock to me to realise now, sort of counting up from 1900 his date of birth, that he was actually a few years younger than me. So clearly he wasn't in any way decrepit. He was in the flush of youth. Well, that's how it goes. When I provided the title for this lecture, I was intending to compare the Welsh Englynion a Beddau with Irish material. But I won't do that after all, because my article about the Irish dimension has appeared in the last number of Eriu, which everybody, of course, will have read in this room. So I don't want to repeat that. So with apologies, I'll concentrate on Wales. And if anybody doesn't like that, they can go now. So, we cross the sea to Wales now. See if I could do this right. Oh. There we go. This is Wales as seen from Ireland. By the way, I put the copyright on this slide, if you could see it, but I haven't done that for the other slides because I didn't have time, so please don't take photos of the screen because I haven't got permission for some of the forbidden fruits that I'll be showing in this lecture. Now, Englynion y Beddau name and describe the burial places of early medieval heroes. The poems provide a key to a narrative literature which is largely lost, and in this they resemble the triads of the island of Britain, Trioedd Ynys Prydain. While the triad's mnemonic function is accomplished by grouping information in threes, Englynion y Beddau are suitable for memorization because they're metrical and they use poetic formulae. Thomas Jones and others have compared Englynion y Beddau with the two late 10th century Irish poems in the Book of Leinster mentioned on the handout. If there was an external source, these two poems are good candidates, since the Welsh, probably via their unreformed class churches, seem to have been aware of Leinster traditions preserved at monasteries like Ferns and Clonmore. All the same, it's very difficult to prove that there was an external source, as I say in the article I just mentioned, and if there was, it could come from some other direction. Now, two series of Englynion y Beddau survive. The series 1 in the Black Book of Carmarthen, Penniarth Manuscript 1, that's on the left, that's about 1250, and derivatives of it on the right, which is on the right, there's series 3. So there's two sets, series 1 and series 3. There is a series 2 and a series 4, but they're basically a modern invention, which I won't go into now. So these are my stemmers. As you can see, there's only one primary manuscript for series 1, that's Penniarth 1, the Black Book of Carmarthen. For series 3, owing to the loss of William Salisbury's manuscript, S, there are actually 5 primary manuscripts. 3 of them were made for Edward Llwyd. By the way, Penniarth 98, which is the one which is used by Thomas Jones and everyone else, this one here, is really just a copy of another manuscript and not a very accurate one, so that really ought to be ignored. It's often said that these poems date to the 9th or 10th centuries, but that's unprovable. Perhaps composition started then, but it then continued over several centuries. In the Black Book, a late medieval scribe added the title Englynion y Beddau, and this is the first attestation of this now customary title, translated as The Stanzas of the Graves by Thomas Jones in his edition. He also included the alternative title, Beddau Milwyr Ynys Prydain, The Graves of the Warriors of the Island of Britain. Although not attested before the early 17th century, this title is quite apt, because all the titles except one, which was added to the Black Book of Carmarthen by a second 13th century scribe, refer to men rather than women. Even the grave of Branwen, who's mentioned in the second branch of the Mabinogi, is missing. With the exception of Beli a Bentley Gawr, another addition which I'll come back to, the warriors seem to be humans rather than giants, although that distinction was fluid and could change over time. Typically, the men are heroes, praised for their ferocity in battle. They come from the whole of Britain, including present-day Scotland and Mercia in England. A few are definite historical people, such as the 5th century Vortigern, and the 6th century Rhoddech of Strathclyde. But the Englynion don't provide new, reliable historical information. We know from Addafnan's life of Columcille that the historical Rhoddech, Rhodercus, died in his bed in Dumbarton, but in Englynion y Beddau, his grave is in Wales, in Aberech, that's sort of opposite Wicklow. This illustrates how characters from various parts of Britain were relocalized in Wales. The obvious context, in this case, would be a legendary expedition recounted in a 13th century Welsh law text, which lists Rhoddech among the leaders of the men of the north who attacked Arfon, that's in northwest Wales. This law tract doesn't say that he escaped back to Scotland, so people might have assumed that he actually died in Wales, and some poet picked Aberech for his gravesite because it was in the right area and it happened to rhyme with his name. Another historical person is Penda of Mercia. We're on to stanza 10 and 9 on the handout. 10 in the Black Book version and 9 in Series 3. Penda died in 655. In Welsh sources, he's called Panna, son of Pede. Series 3 gets the name Panna right, but Panna is corrupted to Rhin in Series 1, as you can see. By the time the Englynion was copied into the Black Book of Carmarthen in the 13th century, Welsh scribes had already given up using insular script. And as a result, when they were copying from it, they made mistakes like confusing the letters P and R, and also U and a flat-topped A. And that seems to have happened in this stanza, and explains R-U-N for the name rather than P-A-N. So the Black Book is wrong with the name, but it's correct in placing Penda's grave in a river, and here it's probably following Bede's account of Penda's last battle, which was in Yorkshire. Bede says the battle was fought near the river Wynwad, and that's probably the river Went in Yorkshire. Here it is in a recent flood. This is the old crossing place. It had overflowed its channels and its banks to such an extent that many more were drowned in flight than were destroyed by the sword in battle. In Series 3, Avon has got altered to Arfon, so a river has become Arfon, the place, perhaps because many of the other graves lie in this region of northwest Wales. One of them, in line C of this same stanza on the handout, was the grave of Cynnon. Cynnon was supposed to have escaped from the Battle of Cattrais, according to the Gododdin. The name Rheon Ford, where he's buried, has not survived, but we know that it was in or near Arfon. An adjacent stanza, which is 110 on the handout, refers to his grave being at Llanbaran, the parish of St Padarn. The only Padarn church in North Wales was near Dolbadarn Castle, beside the isthmus between the two Arfon lakes, Llyn Peris and Llyn Padarn, and I suspect that Rheon Ford was the name of that isthmus. There's an enigmatic megalithic structure there, which you can see here, that could be Cynnon's supposed grave. While Cynnon's grave is in Arfon in northwest Wales, the red marks that on the map here, the other grave in this stanza is the grave of Gwalchmai in South Wales. The grave of Gwalchmai is in Peryddon as a reproach to men. At Llanbaran is the grave of Cynnon. In about 1125, William of Malmesbury localized the grave of Gwalchmai, or rather Walwen or Gawain, that's his form, in Rhos in Pembrokeshire, so as marked at the bottom of the map. This is what he says. In the time of William the Conqueror, there was found in the province of Wales called Rhos the tomb of Walwen, the nephew of Arthur. He reigned in that part of Britain which is still called Walweitha, Galloway. A warrior most renowned for his valour, he was expelled from his kingdom by the brother and nephew of Hengist. The tomb of Arthur is nowhere to be seen, whence ancient dirges fable that he is yet to come. The tomb of Walwen was found in the time of King William upon the seashore, 14 foot in length, and here some say he was wounded by his foes and cast out in shipwreck, but according to others, he was killed by his fellow citizens at a public banquet. Well, if Gwalchmai suffered a treacherous death, as he says, that explains why his grave is called a reproach to men in our stanza 1:8. In the 1150s, John of Cornwall, in his Prophatia Merlini, identified Peryddon with the Bristol Channel, and that would fit a grave on the shores of Rhos very nicely, because the Bristol Channel, of course, runs at the bottom, from the bottom of Wales. A 14-foot grave sounds like a barrow fit for a hero. Incidentally, what William of Malmesbury says about Arthur's grave being unknown is echoed in our poem. A grave for Mach, a grave for Gwythyr, a grave for Gwgawn Redsword, the hardest thing in the world to find, a grave for Arthur, Arois Bede bear the Arthur. Well, since William of Malmesbury, of course, many people have claimed to have found Arthur's grave, and this is just one of many, many candidates. This is in Herefordshire. Manchester University are excavating this at the moment, but they're not expecting to find Arthur there because, as you can see, the period is a few millennia too early. Just to go back, the fact that poets couple within a single stanza graves in different parts of Britain, as in this case, shows that they were interested in ancient British graves in general, not just in a particular locality. Nevertheless, a work not limited to a single geographical locality could still show a regional bias owing to the limitations of its author's knowledge or interests. And this is true of the oldest stratum of Englynion and Beddau, which is biased towards northwest Wales and especially Arfon. A parallel here is the Irish tract on the wonders of Ireland. In its fullest form in the Book of Ballymote, it has 34 entries, of which less than a third refer to Munster and Leinster. And this indicates a northern or central place of origin for the title, for the tract, despite the pan-Irish title. The 11th century Latin version lacks a dozen items, nearly all of which refer to places in Meath. So this indicates that the vernacular Wonders of Ireland was originally a regionally based northern compilation, subsequently conflated with a strongly regional Meath collection of marvels, and then others were added. It's interesting from our point of view that the additions tend to survive in clumps between item 15 and the end of the wonders. Compilers of medieval lists, who were working without file cards, word processors and so on, tended to squeeze in additions at the beginning and end of texts and in clumps at the top and the bottom of pages, and sometimes we could detect these. This procedure can be detected behind our Series 1, where mostly northern material in the first half is followed by mostly southern material in the second. In Series 3, the northern bias is obvious and South Wales is absent. The identifiable places in Series 3 are on the left-hand side. As you can see, they're all in the north, and 9A at the top is pointing into England for Penda's grave. The identifiable places in Series 1 are on the right, and as you can see, they're scattered more widely through Wales. Several stanzas appear in both series, and if we look at these stanzas' similarities with each other, with other ones, with regard to metre, style, and content, just ignoring geography for now, we can recover a core proto-series lying behind Series 1 and Series 3. And this is summarised like this. This proto-series, of course I won't go into detail now, shows a bias towards northwest Wales, especially Arfon. It shows an interest in the characters in the saga Englynion cycles associated with Brycheiniog and Powys in eastern Wales. And thirdly, an interest in graves in rivers or the sea. That's how on some of my maps there seem to be numbers in the middle of the sea. It's not actually a mistake, it's just that the graves of people are in the sea, and some are in rivers, as I said. I'll come back to that. So, to get back to the people who are in the graves, no one later than Penda is mentioned, because the world of Englynion and Beddau is a world of legend rather than history. Characters known from the Mabinogion appear, often with additional information about them, as do some more or less Arthurian characters like Gwalchmai, who we met just now. There are also characters from the early saga Englynion, edited by Jenny Rowland, plus a number of obscure characters known only from passing allusions, if that. They presumably appeared in narratives which are now lost. And this confirms that many medieval stories have disappeared without trace, and this shows the value of Englynion y Beddau as a key to lost literature. This aspect of Englynion y Beddau as a key to history and Dindshenchas in general was one reason why they appealed to antiquaries like Edward Llwyd. Before his untimely death in 1709, he was clearly planning a study of them. He had numerous copies made, and he'd begun compiling an index with his assistant, Moses Williams. On the slide, the ugly writing is Edward Llwyd, and the neat writing is, in the second column, is Moses Williams. Only later did literary critics start to appreciate the poems as poetry, and they were especially impressed by the vague elegiac mood of the three introductory Englynion, which W.B. Yeats quoted in this romantic Victorian translation by his Welsh friend Ernest Rhys. It's a very free translation. In the original, for example, there's no personal voice, though you've got that very clearly in the first stanza here. Literally, the first stanza means the graves which the rain wets, men who had not been accustomed to being provoked, cerwyd and ciwryd and caw. Y beddau a'i gwlich a glaw, gwir ni wrthfynasant ddignaw, cerwyd a ciwryd a chaw. The elegiac style of these and many other stanzas recall the saga Englynion. There are also close similarities with the concise, stark diction of the Gododdin, which similarly tends to focus on individual heroes. Some of their names actually recur in these three stanzas. For the most part, Englynion y Beddau, like the Gododdin and the elegies by later court poets, express an uncompromising heroic ideal without any of the reservations and doubts voiced in the saga Englynion. The late Gwyn Thomas, however, detected elements of playfulness, lolian, in some stanzas, as in the rhyming of Rhyddech and Aberech, mentioned earlier. Assessing the tone of medieval onomastic law is really quite difficult, but it wouldn't be surprising if Gwyn Thomas were right, because elements of burlesque were certainly admitted in works like the Triads, just as gargoyles and Sheila na gigs and grotesques were permitted in medieval churches. Even the ancient litanies of the saints, despite their serious intent, indulged in wordplay, evoking Aldegundis, Radegundis, Monegundis, Theodota, Theodola, Dorothea, Domitella, and so on. Lists were an important and much appreciated element in medieval literature, and people made no rigid distinction between the poetic and the mnemonic. Now, although the three opening stanzas provide an elegiac framework, the Englynion that follow have no obvious sequence. The artistic focus is on the individual Englyn, sometimes finely wrought. Ifor Williams admired their artistry and skillful reticence, tawedogrwydd medrus. The lack of any progression or overarching structure may be due to Englynion y Beddau's long, peaceful creation and interpolation, but the result was presumably acceptable, however it arose, because it's paralleled elsewhere, for example in the saga Englynion. Style without structure, to put it negatively, was one of the norms of Celtic aesthetics, as admired and deplored by Matthew Arnold, who indeed praised the stanza on Arthur's grave, which we saw, as an example of the epigrammatic Celtic style. Now, fragmentary, enigmatic, disjointed verses, though puzzling to the Victorians, appeal more to modern sensibilities. As David Johnson has said, by angen clywed y penillion yn y meddwl o leiaf mwyn iawn werthfawrogi effaith gynyddol rymus y gyfres ar ei hyd. Rhan fawr o swyn yr Englynion hyn i ni yw ei natur enigmatig sy'n gadael cymaint o raff i dychymig yn rhannol am fod y rhan fwyaf o'r cefnau chwedlonol ar goll bellach. In addition, modern Welsh readers are likely to be struck by the Englynion's message of defiance rooted in the locatable specifics of the Welsh language as much as by the elegiacs of the opening stanzas, which evoke the vague, generalised landscape that appeal more to generations reared on Macpherson's Ossian. To quote Richard Glyn Roberts on the slide, the early Englyn poetry has a certain mystery, and many of these fragments have a directness, together with economy, that is closer to our contemporary aesthetic. That, together with the sense of loss and crisis of the Saga Englynion, which seems to echo the situation of the Welsh in the present, probably explains why they've captured the imagination of so many recent writers. And a further reason, which I'll come on to now, for interest in the poems has been their possible archaeological interest. The warriors' graves are typically outside, beneath the rain, hidden under scrub or grass, on hills or mountains. A wolf howls over the grave of an exile with an Irish name, and that's said to be in the wilderness. Some graves are beside or even in estuaries and rivers, while others are on the seashore or under the sea. The grave of Mabon is said to have unknown peculiarities, cynnyddfau, a remark which recalls the marvels like those appended to the 9th century history of the Britons, where a grave is said to mysteriously change in size. Some long graves have already been looted, and others might still yield treasure, one stanza promises. Graves may be four-sided, and one of them has 4 stones around its edge or head. Some heroes lie, it said, under stones, and one lies in a beddau, perhaps a cairn of stones thrown together, or a grave with a surrounding curb, depending on the meaning of the element core. Some of the graves in Englynion and Beddau have been plausibly identified with prehistoric monuments. Already in the 17th century, John Jones of Gelli Lyfdy connected the Englyn on the Belly, son of Bentley the giant, with a supposed grave in northeast Wales marked by 2 limestone stones at each end, which has now disappeared, as you'll hear. He says, translating this, "There is a place on the mountain between Jarl and Ystrad Alyn above Rhydygyfarthfa, which is called y Maes Mawr, where the battle took place between Meirion, son of somebody, and Beli, son of Bentley the giant, in which Beli, son of Bentley, was slain. And Meirion placed 2 stones, one at each end of the grave, which were there up to within these 40 years. There came an uncouth individual, one Edward ap Siôn ap Llywelyn of Jarl, who owned the piece of land which had been enclosed from the mountain in which the grave and the above stones were, and pulled up the stones and placed them over the pipe of a lime kiln. And in consequence of the intense heat they broke, because they were limestones, which cannot stand the heat and weight at the same time. And after they broke, he smashed and roasted them into lime in the kiln, stones which had been there for hundreds of years, and a bad end befell him. He who defaced the grave of that dead warrior, to whom the poet had sung this Englyn in the stanzas of the graves of the island of Britain. Whose is the grave on Maes Mawr, whose hand grasp was firm on his blades, the grave of Beli, son of Bentley the giant?" This motif that people who meddle with old monuments meet a very bad end is something you get quite often in McAllister's corpus. He tends to collect information of what happens to people who touch ancient stones. Now, hardly any graves are near churches, presumably because the early heroes were assumed to have lived before churchyard burial became the norm from the 7th century onwards. And you can see the same dichotomy in the Irish analogues. No stanzas refer to famous kings of the 7th century onwards. Penda, who we've seen, is a special case because he was a pagan Mercian king, and he presumably drowned, or was presumed to have drowned, when the river Wynwad overflowed its banks. The only reference to a burial at an eglwys, a church, as opposed to a llan, is in stanza 5, and that's on the handout. Kerry Longsword's grave is in the region of Hen Eglwys, in the gravelly precipice in Corbra's graveyard. The blue arrow shows where Hen Eglwys in Anglesey is. The church there was formerly dedicated to a saint with the Irish name Corbray. The churchyard is of the early round type, and it's sited above a deeply cut stream valley, the precipice mentioned in the stanza perhaps. The place name Hen Eglwys, former church, seems to indicate that the 12th century church was named from an older church at or near the same site, and possibly Kerry's grave was some ancient mound that was incorporated within Corbra's graveyard. The other stanza, which I mentioned now, which is number 4, that's on the handout, is Dillon's grave, which is in or at Llanfaenor. The pink arrow shows where that is. Llanfaenor is said to be where the wave makes a noise. Now here the reference is probably not to the church itself at Clydog, but to a gigantic boulder called Maen Dillon, Dillon Stone, 1.5 miles up the coast from the church. There it is. Dillon's death is mentioned in the fourth branch of the Mabinogi. And according to the Book of Taliesin, waves that crash against the shore are avenging Dillon's death. The other grave in this stanza is the grave of Tydau Tardawen, a legendary bard, and that's at Bryn Arian. This site is now called Bryn Beddau, the Hill of the Graves. Bryn Arian is next to Maen Dillon and also features in the Mabinogi. This area of Arfon, near Clydog, is prominent both in the Mabinogi and in Englynion Beddau, and that was already noted about 1150 by Eben Varth, who ran a school in Clydog, and by John Jones, the rector of Llanllyfni nearby. These two men had quite cordial relations, except in 1838 when they fell out, because John Jones preached a sermon saying that Clydog was notoriously the most drunken spot in the whole of Wales. This didn't go down well, but they seemed to get on again later. But Jones fell out permanently with the South Welsh scholar Thomas Stevens, who questioned some of his wilder identifications of where graves were, and some of them were extremely wild. As a result, Eben Varth sent Stevens this little-known map of the locality. Hardly anybody knows about. This is just a detail. This is a bit odd because south is at the top of this map, and I hope you can see at the top is the ancient abbey of Clydog Fawr is mentioned just by the sea in the top right-hand corner. A little further below are the rivers Llyfni, and then right at the bottom right, the river Dillon, going into the sea. Now, one of the stanzas in Series 1 is of a grave between Llyfni and its tributaries, and Series 3 has another one between Llyfni and Dillon. In the 18th and 19th centuries, this latter site was identified, quite plausibly, with a Bronze Age standing stone under which weapons were found, plus a funerary urn nearby. Here's an old photo of it. Not a very clear photo, but this is the Bronze Age stone just in the right place. Now, going back to Eben Varth's map, the name in the middle, Bryn Gwydion, here, Bryn Gwydion, this commemorates Gwydion, one of the major characters in the Mabinogi. And in Englynion Beddau, his grave on the shore, not far away presumably, is mentioned. In the far right of the manuscript, I think you can read that in this light, but it mentions Tre Caer Arianrhod, a sunken city just off the coast, which was ruled by Gwydion's sister, Arianrhod. The river just above is the Desach, and he calls it, by the older name, Aberdeen Desach, which means the estuary of the fort of the Deishi, settlers from Ireland, of course. The native Welsh name of this river was Weddis or Morweddis, and that was an estate which belonged to Clydog Monastery, given to them in the 9th century, according to the charter. Now, Series 3 places the grave of a North British chieftain, Ellidir Mwynfawr, on the bank of the Merweddys, that is this river here, the Dindshenchas River. According to the story in the Triads, this Ellidir Mwynfawr and all his followers came down from the north on one single sea-going horse from the distant north somewhere to Penllech in Anglesey. And he evidently came on to Arfon afterwards, because the 13th century Arfon law text, which I mentioned, which was probably redacted at Clonnog, says that he was slain at Abermerweddys, at the mouth of this river. The tract also mentions the role of a character called Myles Hynarth, the Lord of Penarth, and that's the Penarth at the top of this map. And there's a megalithic chambered tomb. I think, can you see it says Cromlech here? Is that legible? Just beneath Penarth. And that presumably would be the site of the grave, which looks like that now. Of course, none of this is historical, but people attach these stories to any old monument which looked as if it needed an explanation. Right. Now I want to finish by looking at the likely growth, relationship and transmission of the texts. Up to the 12th century, most Welsh literature was probably preserved in the old unreformed churches called classi, and a selection of these are given in italics on this map. Now, everything points to the core of Englynion Beddau, what I called the proto-series, having been transmitted through the class church of St Beddau at Clonnog in Arfon in the northwest. As we saw, this proto-series showed a bias towards northwest Wales, especially Arfon, and interesting characters in the early saga Englynion associated with the eastern side of Wales, and interesting graves in rivers and under the sea, which was obviously a matter of interest for a church on the coast. The full history of Clonnog Church is given in my edition of the life of St Beddau, which the Institute launched here exactly 5 years ago tonight to this day. So I'll put an advert in for it here. It's published by the Institute. Apparently there's still copies available according to the website. Yeah, okay. I expect a fee for this advert. Now, end of advert. The map on the left shows the identifiable places in what I call the Clonnog layer of Series 1. You can see that a few are a long way from Clonnog. Penda's grave is in England, hence the arrow at the top, and the grave of Gwalchmai is right down in the southwest. We've looked at that already. But leaving those aside, most are in the northwest. There are two in the east, that's 32 to 33. That's an underestimate because some other graves related to the saga Englynion are in the east as well, but I can't pinpoint them on the map. As you can see, the general pattern is similar to that of the places relevant to Clonnog, as shown in the map on the right, which is from my edition of St Beddau's Life, published by the Institute. Now, graves 32 to 33, those two identifiable ones in the east, are at Hir Fynydd, probably Long Mountain on Offa's Dyke. Not far from Professor Lewis's birthplace, I have to add. Not that that's on the map. But that's big by no country. Now, the map shows this is number 32, which I think is on the handout. Yes, it is, near the bottom of the page. This map shows the Long Mountain towards the bottom, and the green is Offa's Dyke, marking the old border. And of course, this was a heroic area of conflict. According to stanza 32 on the handout, the graves on Hir Fynydd, that's Long Mountain, crowds know them well. If I had to guess, I'd identified these graves, which crowds know well, with some of the many barrows along the ridgeway, along the top of the long mountain. You just go along there, these graves, and crowds, of course, would go along the ridgeway, because it's impossible to prove that. During the 12th century, lay patronage shifted from the old class churches, like Clunog, to the new Cistercian monasteries. In Ireland, you wouldn't associate the Cistercians with vernacular learning particularly, but in Wales, parts of the order went native, as it were, and used Welsh very extensively. And there's, in fact, some evidence in Ireland for this, and that's at Tracton in County Cork. Welsh Cistercians from Hendy-Gwyn, that's Whitland in Wales, had established a daughter house there in 1224, and in the records of the order, they get into big trouble for speaking Welsh rather than Latin and French in the monastery. Of course, no mention of Irish, needless to say. Latin and French, which they should have speaking, and creating a Tower of Babel in Tracton by having Welsh, so they were banned from doing it. Whether it had any effect, who knows? In 2020, Professor Lewis argued persuasively that early Welsh texts written in the old class churches survived if they, I quote, were valued and copied in one of the new Cistercian abbeys. He instanced Bonner the Saint, probably composed at Clunog. Now, I think that Englynion Beddau had a similar history. In 1164, Hendy-Gwyn set up a daughter house, a very important one, at Strata Florida. The arrow shows that. And in 1186, Strata Florida set one up at Llanfairpwllgwyngyllgogerychwr Felen in the north, and that relocated to Aberconwy very quickly by 1192. So this creates a sort of network through Wales. As Llanfairpwllgwyngyllgogerychwr Felen is only 5 miles from Clunog, literary material from Clunog could easily have come there and on to Aberconwy. Around about 1217, Aberconwy, facing Llywelyn ap Iorwerth's court at Deganwy over the River Conwy, was a centre for literary activity, including genealogies, as argued by Ben Guy, chronicles, as argued by Owen Wyn-Jones, and Taliesin poetry, as argued by Margaret Haycock. As she showed, a feature of the Taliesin poems is the inclusion of difficult questions which only the legendary Taliesin can answer. We find exactly the same thing in Series 1, but not at all in Series 3. Many stanzas begin with the question, Pia'r bedd, whose is this grave? Ask me, I know it. For example, whose is the grave on the slope of the hill? Many ask it who do not know. The grave of Coel, son of Kenvelin. And this is the true voice of Taliesin. A good example is stanza 42 on the handout, which is at the bottom of the page. Elfyn took me to test my poetic learning for the first time above a leader, the grave of Rhyfawn, prince of a warband. In the story, Elfyn was Taliesin's patron, so Taliesin must be speaking here. Evidently, the young poet had to stand on Rhyfawn's grave and identify the occupant. This is a motif found very early on in the life of St. Martin, but it's also found in connection with Colin Keeler. Rhyfawn's supposed grave was at Llanfairpwllgwyngyllgogerychwr in the northwest corner of Anglesey. Not really a grave at all, but the foundations of this Roman watchtower, which has been excavated recently. You probably can't really see, but that's looking out towards Ireland there from the top of this promontory. And the watchtower will be able to see Holyhead and over to Ireland to generally see what was going on. The map on the left shows the Series 1 stanzas which are associated with Aberconwy. Numbers 42 to 43 are at the watchtower, which I mentioned just now, at the top left. The map on the right shows the remaining Series 1 stanzas, mostly in the second half of it and mostly in the south. Probably the northern material from Clonnog and Aberconwy came south in the early 13th century and was combined with stanzas about southern graves before getting copied into the Back Book of Carmarthen, which is in the south, by circa 1250. And the Cistercian networks provide an obvious route. On the map, I've named relevant Cistercian monasteries. Now, a vague geographical proximity proves very little, of course, but some stanzas refer to very obscure places with a close connection to Strata Florida. Line C of number 26, which is in the bottom right, within the red circle, this is the grave of Epint in the valley of Gevel. This is beside Strata Florida's Tirabad grave. And then 60 to 61 at the top of that circle concern the graves of Tavlogai and Llyn between two adjacent rivers on Strata Florida's remote Cwm Ystwyth grave. Tavlogai and Rhythnant are the names of the rivers. The Gevel and Tavlogai rivers are distinguished by remarkably deep ravines, and the two stanzas have in common their audacious creation of eponyms. Epint comes from the mountain name Epint, and Tavlogai from the river name Tavlogai. And the final one, which seems to be in a different place, is at 26A at the top. This records the grave of Llia, the Irishman, Llia Gwyddel, in distant Ardudwy. At first sight, this coupling of distant places in 26, one further down in the south and one up further north, looks odd. It looks inexplicable. But you probably have to suppose that Llia, the Irishman, was a local hero supposedly commemorated by an extant megalith called Maen Llia, which is 15 miles south of the place marked as 26C. Here it is now. It's absolutely massive. This is a boulder brought by ice in the remote past. This Maen Llia, Llia's stone, it's possibly got oghams on it, by the way. As I argued in the article in Eriw, the Irish word Llia, meaning a stone, may have been misunderstood as a personal name by the Welsh and assigned to a hero connected with standing stones. So a stone which was thus called Llia by Irish settlers would get called Maen Llia by the Welsh, and then Llia will be the name, thought to be the name of the person attached to the stone, so it will be Llia's stone. Now, to go back, so this is the next one here. The places rigged in red were all associated with the Premonstratensian Abbey of Tallaghlychai. Round about 1200, the Cistercians of Hendy Gwyn staged an aggressive takeover bid and succeeded in taking over some of Tallaghlychai's estates. The inclusion of these grave stanzas could be connected with this in some way. Rigged in blue, stanzas 36 to 38 are grouped around the Cistercian house of Cwm Hir and its granges. The hero of 45 may be eponym of a lost Llech Elwythan, stone of Elwythan, granted to Cwm Hir in 1199. Then finally, 48, which is at the top left of the blue circle, is number 48, Bruino the Tall. He's the eponym of Bruino, a distant area of pasturage granted to Cwm Hir in 1201, and then disputed with Ystrad Machell, another Cistercian house, until 1227, when a gathering of over 50 persons met to agree a compromise in the presence of many Cistercian abbots and priors. According to stanza 48, which is on the handout, whose is this grave? The grave of Bruino the Tall, whose entitlement was strong in his land. Where he would be, there would be no retreat. It's tempting to see an allusion here to the monastic dispute in the description of Bruino Hir, whose entitlement was strong in his land. Did Bruino symbolize a Cistercian claim to the land? Professor Thomas Jones identified Bruino's grave with a prehistoric stone alignment above Bruino. he didn't know this, but these stones are mapped as Cerrig Hirion, tall stones, on a 1788 field boundary shown here. In the bottom left, it says Cerrig Hirion running up. And the name Bruino, I think you can see in the far right towards the bottom. Now these stones were sadly damaged in recent tree felling. That's me holding up a bit which has been broken off. It's a very sad sight. But as with many grave sites in the stanzas, there's a magnificent view, in this case across to Ireland. So you can see the devastation in the front and then the view right across the Irish Sea. Finally, to get back to map 9, 5 stanzas in series 1, all marked here in green, may refer to monuments either near the Cistercian Abbey at Neath, which still had Welsh links in the early 13th century, or the Roman road that leads north from it, north from Neath, towards Brecon. Number 62, which is on the handout, is the grave of Bradwen, who was resolute in demanding Wergild. He may be connected with Mine Bradwen, this massive stone above Neath Abbey. This is a Bronze Age stone, now a convenient gatepost, but rather larger than you really need for a gatepost, but fortunately that one's still standing. The next slide I'll show is looking down from the stone towards Neath Abbey. So, you know, the monks down there would see the stone up, well, you can't see, up off the picture. And of course they would speculate it, one supposes. Speculate about it. The warrior in the next stanza, number 63, that was 62, is Mine Madog. He may be commemorated by, that is Madog, and he may be commemorated by Mine Madog, which is 16 miles up the Roman road from where we were just now. Whose is the four-sided grave with its 4 stones around its edge? The grave of Madog, a determined rider. So, my hypothesis is that between 1200 and 1250, when the Black Book of Carmarthen was written, Englynion collected or created by Cistercian houses in the south were added to a text of Englynion y Beddau transmitted from Aberconwy in the north. A Cistercian interest in grave stanzas is interesting and understandable. Like the class clergy before them, the Cistercians were closely tied to the land and must have been aware of local traditions, landmarks, and intriguing place names. In fact, you can see that from the bounds of their charters, which often include sort of things like Arthur's Stone and this and that, referring to traditions. To what extent the gravestones were actually composed in the Cistercian houses as opposed to being collected there is impossible to say. So, to conclude this trip to Wales, the first half of the Series 1 and most of Series 3 concentrate on heroes and graves that would have been interesting to the community of St Bino's Church at Clonnog, where many of the Englynion may have been committed to writing by the early 12th century and quite possibly before. Given the evidence for Welsh emulation of Irish scholarship from the 9th century onwards, it's possible, if unprovable, that the initial collection of Englynion y Beddau was inspired by the 10th century Irish poems in the Book of Leinster mentioned at the beginning of the handout. Like those poems, the original core was expanded by interpolation and addition. This probably occurred after the text had passed from the Clonnog class to the Cistercians of Llannog Felen, who then removed to Aberconwy about the end of the 12th century. At Aberconwy, the poem was recast about 1217 as part of the repertoire of the legendary boastful Taliesin, and its geographical range was expanded, reflecting the widening horizons of Llywelyn ap Iorwerth's realm. By the early 13th century, Aberconwy had transmitted Series 1 to a Cistercian monastery in the south, most likely its own mother church at Stratafloridor. The Cistercians then contributed further stanzas that reflected their own southern interests. Thanks to them, when Series 1 reached the scribe of the Black Book of Carmarthen in the south, the Welsh Dindshenchas had a much more national range than when they started out in Arfon. Yep.
Thank you, Patrick. That was extraordinary. A text I've often wondered about ever since I began in Celtic Studies, and I've never really got to the bottom of, but some really clear and fascinating arguments there. Patrick's very kindly agreed to take some questions. I don't know if anyone is all feeling a bit blown away. Any questions at all? Rory?
Thanks, Patrick, for a splendid lecture. Very interesting. Another text you might consider is the Shanafus na Bredig in
yes.
LU,
Yes.
which again has the graves of famous people. And a lot of the famous people, like the Welsh people, are shown to be names abstracted from toponyms in the locality.
Yes.
So it's similar.
Yes, I sort of put that in as an additional example of Irish material in the article area.
Oh, right.
I didn't pursue it very much. I realised that would be a vast topic in the end. In the end, you can't really pin it down as being an influence, but there's a lot of similarity. Then Ireland and Wales were very similar, and people were interested in monuments in the land and explaining that maybe it's almost a universal thing. So you don't get it so much in Anglo-Saxon England, but then the Anglo-Saxons left their traditions on the continent when they came over. So you hear that Hugelac's grave was actually on the continent, but you couldn't actually visit it.
Do you get in the West Country, in Cornwall, where certain rock formations are attributed to Arthur, I think?
That's right, yes. Well, Arthur is, he's the person. It varies over time, of course, who the fashionable person is. It might be, like Finn in Ireland. Arthur gradually accumulates more and more places, yeah. Other people drop out.
And a slight English parallel, not a very close one, is the the burial places of the saints.
Yep.
Text, which actually are quite geographical.
Yes, that's right, because the first part is mostly Northumbria, and then the second half of the text is much more Wessex orientated. So that's a good example of somebody updating something and not entirely sort of shuffling the cards, but you can see a difference. And I rather think there that places are identified in relation to rivers in the older part of the text, but in relation to places in the latter part, which perhaps suggests a different way of looking at the world, because rivers are so important, or were so important in charters at the early period, because that really was a fixed boundary you couldn't do anything about. There's places, of course, pinpoint, rather than be implying a larger area. Yeah, that's a good parallel.
Yes.
Okay, what would you give credence to the possibility? You mentioned there about Hanno, son of Pyre, around 655. And the Gaelic Ulutian clan came into, they say, the text is, that they came into southwest Wales. And now you said that the Dacia seemed to be in the middle. And they also say that a Leinster clan came in through Englynion around 500, 600 Columcille's time. And then we get a text that says they became Christianized, the Welsh became Christianized, and the Welsh monks then leave to go down to Brittany. And they take over Brittany, and they evangelize Brittany and Christianize Brittany. And then the Cistercians, 500 years later, come along, seem to access a tradition that's Welsh, it's there, and they move back up. And they move into the landscape, the Cistercian monasteries, and they have some record of the original 600 people that they're trying to stamp onto the 1100 map. I don't know if you give credence to that at all, or if it's a possibility. And is the myths then pre-600 that they're actually talking about? Most of them are, and they're accessing a myth that's like 1,000 years old now.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't go down that path myself. I mean, one can't condense so many centuries, you don't really have to. Certainly there were Irish settlements in Wales in various places, especially in the southwest and in the northwest, the Llŷn Peninsula, generally supposed to be people from Leinster, and indeed Ptolemy refers to the Ganganoi as being in both sides of the Irish Sea, and presumably this was quite common. The Welsh were, as it were, Christian all the way since the time of the Romans. When Ireland became Christian, well, of course, this is another question altogether. But whether I don't think you could really connect that with these settlements. But certainly on the memorial stones, we find plenty of Ogham being used in Irish names. We're talking about the 5th and 6th centuries. Because what I'm talking about is so much later that I would think that the Irish names, which aren't very many of them, but appear in these texts, could have come in at almost any stage. So I'd avoid creating a fascinating synthesis like you're suggesting here. But who knows what's possible when we haven't got any records for so many periods here.
Moira?
Thanks very much, Patrick. Can I, because you mentioned in passing both trials and the saga in Englynion, and I wanted you just to, what do you see, are there specific textual connections between those two texts in particular and Englynion? Are you thinking about just a kind of a similar approach, as it were, to context?
Yeah, so I've sort of made a chart of names, and there's quite a lot of overlap between the triads and Englynion and Beddau. Of course, some very notable people like Arthur and Gwalchmai and so on appear, but there's an awful lot of people in the triads who don't appear in Englynion and Beddau, and vice versa. So there's some overlap. There's some people perhaps you couldn't fail to mention or something, some big names. But the general impression you get is that there was a vast amount of local knowledge around the place which didn't get into writing. And when you think of it, although there are quite a lot of sites on these maps, every place you go, every valley you go to in Wales, there's some interesting stone there, and presumably many of them, judging by place name, had a story attached to them. So it's surprising how little material there is rather than how much, but it hasn't got into manuscript form, alas. So I don't think there's a direct connection, but maybe people who were handling these texts were familiar with. And the 12th century is round about the period when things are really getting going, even if the material had been around earlier to some extent, as far as I can see.
Any further questions? Yeah, Lizzie.
Just follow on from what you're saying there about why some places are recorded and not others. Is there any correlation with sort of boundaries or edges of estates? Because I wondered, you mentioned in passing that some of these monuments could be used to mark charter bounds and so on. Is there a practical motivation behind why some places are selected and others aren't?
Yes, of course, a lot of our knowledge of place names comes from the boundaries of charters, because they go into such detail, and so one tends to see the connections. They don't name the places kind of in the middle. But I think boundaries were terribly important, and there's a stone called Hirvain Gwyddog, which is mentioned in a 9th century charter in the book of the Literary Gospels. That's still standing now, and it's been a boundary mark between states and shires and so on down to this day, and it's got a name to it, and I imagine it's always been the centre of stories, but the stories have never been written down, but it's got a name. If you go there and talk to the man who lives there, he'll tell you some stuff, but it's not written down.
So, any further questions? I can ask in that case. Ian, about the later construction of the text, do you see a single southern stage in a particular place, or are you envisioning the text going from house to house?
I get the impression, but you know about this stuff, of course, the Cistercians, once they got hold of a text, they tended to syndicate it around the place, whether it's genealogies or whatever, because that's how the Cistercians operated. So the Augustinians maybe tended to, keep to themselves, but I think they did send stuff around, so I imagine people added stuff, and certainly in the Black Book you could see stanzas are added at the end in a different hand, and it's the obvious thing to do, because any self-respecting abbot would say, well, how come they've got all these things? There's nothing about round here, surely there should be something about Madog's grave or whoever we've got. That's human nature, isn't it? What's interesting is there's nothing from southeast Wales, there's nothing from the anglicised parts, because the Normans wouldn't have been interested in the stuff.
That matches the geography of the science.
Yeah, same sort of pure Awalia sort of area.
Any final questions? No? In that case, can we thank Patrick for his outstanding lecture.